Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. The interview with Hugh Hewitt today is with George Will. Now, I don't think it's possible for any of my listeners, all 6 million of them, to actually not know who George Will is. And if you don't, I don't know why you are listening to me, because George Will is the most influential American columnist at work today. His brand new book, American Happiness and Discontents, is in bookstores now, and I have the pleasure of a long conversation I had with George Will. George Will, welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
I'm glad to be with you.
Now, George, it is a good bet on my part that you did not watch the Emmys last night. Am I correct?
You certainly are correct. I was having dinner with the owner of the Colorado Rockies talking baseball. That's fun.
I knew that. I didn't know you were having dinner with him, but I had a good get. Ted Lasso won a lot of awards. I'm just curious, before we get into the book, American Happiness and Discontents, have you watched Ted Lasso yet?
I watched the first season and loved it. I started the second season and thought, not so much, and went on to back to baseball.
You know, George Will, it is scary sometimes how much I have the same reactions you do. Number two, have you watched Only Murders in the Building yet? This is leading somewhere having to do with American Happiness and Discontents, lest you be concerned. Have you watched Only Murders in the Building yet?
I've not only not watched it, I've not heard of it.
It is a new series starring Stephen Martin, who's 75, Martin Short, who is 70. It is funny as can be. It is wonderful. And I bring it up because it features Sting, whose music began this segment, who at 69 is a fine craftsman. All of these actors are fine craftsmen in their later years. They are lucky to be in a business in which your age chronologically does not matter. You and I are blessed that way too, and that is coming through in American Happiness and Discontent. You've been doing this for 5 decades.
And loving every minute of it. Minute of it. You know the old saying that if you love your work, you'll never work a day in your life.
Yes.
One of my basic theories of life has been refuted by me. My theory is that the price system is rational, but it's not in my case because I'm paid to do what I would pay to do. So
both of those points made in a wonderful introduction to American Happiness and its Discontents. And there's a lot in that introduction I want to go back to, but I want to stay on this point of durability and longevity. Last week, Harvey Mansfield was on my show. Harvey's 89. I assume you have some regard for him.
I've taught a course with him at Harvard twice with Harvey and Michael Sandel. Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Wonderful.
Well, Harvey was my lead professor when I was an undergraduate long ago and far away. And he is at 89, and he said he's intellectually sharp, but that energy is an issue as you age. Not that your abilities erode, but you can't do as much of them as you can. Do you agree with that proposition?
Not yet. I'm exercising more than I used to. I'm afraid it's grim to say that the pandemic has been good for my health because I started eating better and I'm exercising more. I've got the same energy. I'll tell you what turning 80 did. Marking a new decade never mattered to me. A kind of serenity came over me. And I kept thinking to myself, what was it that had me so lathered up during, say, the Carter administration? I can't remember any of it. And it's not my memory that's failing. It's my sense of proportion, I think, has become better. The idea that the earth-shaking events happen all the time is refuted by the fact that, come to think about it, the earth almost never shakes.
I think I'm quoting from memory. It's in my notes. I'll get to it later. Presidents come and go. They are temporary. Only the Constitution and the American Creed endure. Did I get that right?
Absolutely right.
All right. So we'll come back to that. It's in my notes. But I bring up age because it seems to me that it does become an issue when it is an issue, and that President Biden appears to me to be infirm. Do you agree with that estimate? Not demented, not losing his mind, but just old.
Well, remember, we've all seen Mr. Biden on the world stage for almost half a century. I first interviewed him when he got here in 1973. So we instinctively compare him to the spring chicken we knew a long time ago. Second, he walks with a kind of elderly man's stiffness. Third, they have his communications people who really need to be cleaned out and started over have put him out in settings that are just don't go to his strength. some of these town hall settings. Fourth, he's had a kind of speech problem, stuttering, not uncommon for people, has nothing to do with cognitive ability. So take all those things together, and I think he has given the impression of not being quite up to speed. That said, this also was exacerbated by the Afghan pullout, where he seemed to say things that just weren't so. And then in his vaccine mandate statement, when he said, A, you must all get vaccinated because it's wonderfully effective, and B, the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated. Now, you can't square those two propositions. So take all these things together. I think he's had a perfectly miserable summer, one aspect of which, I guess summer's over, isn't it?
Yes.
One aspect of which is that people are questioning his energy level, I guess.
Well, that's what Harvey made the point. He said you don't necessarily lose your intellectual capability. He hasn't, Harvey, but you do lose an energy reservoir. So there is a temptation to simply ignore some problems and wish them away so that you can conserve the energy you still have for the problems you want to deal with, and that President Biden had simply wished Afghanistan away. But as Harvey pointed out, and the transcript is up, America, at HughHewitt.com if you want to read the transcript with Harvey, you can't wish some problems away, one of which is Afghanistan. There are still Americans there. We have abandoned Americans and thousands of legal permanent residents. I think, George Will, and it's too timely to be in American Happiness and Discontents. It's one of the most shameful episodes as an American I've ever watched our country involve itself in. What do you think?
It is shameful. It is unnecessary, too. Intelligent people of goodwill can disagree about whether or not we ought to even have left a remnant in Afghanistan. I think we should for intelligence purposes and for certain air cover for the Afghan army. But that's settled now. Did we have to leave Bagram Air Base in the dead of night without telling the Afghan official there? Things like that were just inexplicable.
And shameful. We have Americans abandoned. I wake up at night worrying about. Let me move back to American Happiness and Discontents. If I gave you 100 guesses, you would never guess what made me happiest about American Happiness and Discontents. So I'll just tell you. It's the number of times the name Timothy Sandifer appeared. Timothy Sandifer is the greatest student I have taught in 25 years of teaching constitutional law. In fact, he wasn't my student. I was his student. He annoyed me from the top row left side in my large law school amphitheater classroom at Chapman Law School because he was then and remains brilliant. And I love the fact that you really routinely consult with Institute for Justice, the Goldwater Center, the Cato Institute, and you care about lawyers like Timothy who follow a purposeful constitutionalism.
In my 50 years as a columnist, there's one subject enormously important on which I've simply changed my mind 180 degrees. When I started, I was like my good friend Bob Bork, who was like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a great majoritarian. He said, America is about majority rule, and therefore courts should defer. We should have judicial restraint. I've decided that's exactly wrong, that the courts are too restrained, that America is not about majority rule, it's about liberty, that courts are the last defenders of that because Lord knows Congress is no longer inclined to respect the idea that we have a government of limited powers. The executive, Lord knows, will not restrain itself, particularly because Congress is offloading its responsibilities onto the executive agencies and the administrative state. Therefore, if we're going to have limited government, the judiciary has to police the frontiers of democracy here. So that's why people like Timothy Sandifer and Clark Neely, preaching judicial engagement at the Cato Institute, and Roger Pilon, who's the godfather of much of this, also at Cato. That's why these people are so important.
And you are a constitutionalist, as I am, George Will. And I want to talk about that in the Trump context. But first, I just have to note, you paid Justice Scalia the equal of any compliment when you said on page 459 of American Happiness and Discontent, very simply, he had a vast talent for friendship. Is there any compliment greater than that?
I think not. Bill Buckley had that. Bill Buckley's friends included John Kenneth Galbraith, Harvard economist who believed everything Bill didn't. Bill was a friend with Murray Kempton, the columnist who was a man of the left, the man who influenced my life just by showing me what fun it could be to write and read a good column. No, a talent for friendship means that you've got politics in its place. Politics is important, but not all important.
I want people to know, and this, I don't mean to embarrass George Will, but as Murray Kempton is to George Will is to Hugh Hewitt, because I'm 15 years younger, and I was reading his columns and saying, I want to do that. And when you started showing up on ABC News, I said, I want to do that. That's what I want to do, because that seems to me to be the most fun in public life with a grain of importance attached. So I pay you that compliment. I think you have a vast talent for friendship as well. Now let's get to where we disagree. I think it's fair to say you think Trump was a disaster, and I think he was difficult. But I also think it's fair to say you believe deeply in protecting the Constitution and the institutions and separation of power it establishes. So that brings us to the toughest point on which we probably disagree. Without Trump, we would have had Hillary. With Hillary, we would have had at least 2 and probably 3 appointments, and the court would be lost, if not forever, the Constitution with it, then for generations. But with Trump, we have Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. It seems to me dispositive that he was a necessary president given the choice before us. George Will.
I certainly rejoice in the fact that the justices he appointed were appointed. I also would note that any Republican would have appointed similar justices. Any Republican would have taken a list from, wouldn't even need a list, in most Republicans' case, they'd have known these things, from the Federalist Society. So all I'm saying is that the fact that the law of averages caught up with Mr. Trump and he did some right things doesn't excuse the rest of his presidency, because, as I say, any Republican would have gone there.
To which I have to respond. That is interesting, but not dispositive. When the American people have to choose between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, is it not a very good thing that in that choice on that day, they picked Donald Trump, knowing what we know now?
It was a very good thing for the judiciary, and the judiciary is very important, but it is not all important. That's the question here, is a question of striking a balance between goods and defects.
Yes, and knowing what we know, and knowing that it was going to be one of those two, are we not better off that it was Trump than Hillary? And it's not even close, because I do believe the Constitution would have been lost, George Will.
I think the Constitution has suffered under Mr. Trump. I think the Constitution suffered under almost all modern presidents, but particularly under his, because, as you know, being a good scholar of this, Trump was a little bit out over his skis when he says, I have Article 2 and I can do whatever I want. He sort of expressed with customary bluntness the thinking that has infested the presidency since Theodore Roosevelt developed the stewardship idea of the presidency, which was that a president can do anything he's not explicitly forbidden to do.
Well, I agree with you, by the way, on that. I believe he often exceeded his constitutional, and the court rebuked him when he did. But now I've got the exact quote in front of me. I wasn't far off when I did it from memory. Presidents come and go. They are all temporary. The Constitution and the American creed bind. If that is true, as your late friend Charles Krautheimer said, politics is sovereign. In his last book, he wrote Politics is Sovereign. Given both of those things, it is impossible to argue that given Trump and Hillary, we ought to have voted for Hillary. I think it's impossible to argue for that.
It's possible to argue all kinds of things, Hugh, and I would argue that the damage done to this country's civic culture and to the fact that you cannot unring a bell and you can't unsay the things he said, and you can't make an assault on truth of the sort that he did, where he departed from the truth for no apparent reason other than to demonstrate that he could get away with it. I think that the damage he did to the coarsening our civic life is worse than and will be more long-lasting than, harder to recover from, the surreptitious felonies, say, that the Nixon administration did and that got Mr. Nixon for which he was impeached.
That might be true, but I'm going to be Dustin Hoffman and wag the dog. That's nothing compared to the Constitution. All right, let's move on. Let's move on. You admire Justice Gorsuch, as do I. He's been a guest on this show, a guest of mine at the Nixon Library, which I helm. But Bostock was poorly decided, in my view. You appear to think that Bostock was well decided. One senator told me that after Bostock, no more nominees with ties to the D.C. area at all or desire to be admired by Beltway folk. Give me boring Midwesterners who go to church and teach Sunday school and know the Constitution, because they will not come up with Bostock decisions. Now, the Chief Justice, who's a friend of mine, joined in that, I believe, for reasons strategic more than any other. I think he will vote to reverse Bostock when the opportunity arises. But did you like the bottom line in Bostock, the way that Justice Gorsuch, his originalism and textualism departed from, say, Justice Alito's?
Well, I don't think that liking the bottom line is as important as, and your question suggests this rightly, is how you get to the bottom line. Now, textualism and originalism, understood as we should construe the Constitution in terms of the original public meaning at the time of ratification of the crucial terms. That seems to me inadequate for reasons that caused the great Scalia himself to call himself a faint-hearted originalist when he came up against the fact of the Eighth Amendment's prescription of cruel and unusual punishments. The fact is, and Scalia, to his great credit, said this, if a state brought back flogging, no, can't do that, even though flogging was perfectly common at the time that cruel and unusual punishments were prescribed by the founders' original public meaning. So I don't have a strict orthodoxy in construing the Constitution. I suppose, Hugh, if I were to categorize myself, I'd say I'm originalist of intent. That is, the Eighth Amendment was written because we intended a society without cruelty. And, frankly, Warren, I think it was Warren, got it right when he said in a 1958 case that the cruel and unusual punishments clause takes its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the maturation of a society. Now, Scalia rightly said, evolving doesn't mean improving necessarily. Quite right to warn us of that. But we've made enormous actual objective improvements in our evolving standards of decency and how we treat people, African Americans, gay people, etc. And it seems to me incumbent upon us to incorporate that into our construction of the Constitution.
And I believe every word you just said is correct, and I've taught that for 25 years. When it came to the word sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, however, I believe Justices Gorsuch and the five who joined with him misconstrued the original intent of those who framed it, who meant, I think, women and men, not sex, and that he did not intend. The Constitution's due process clause may very well require the decision that Anthony Kennedy made in the same-sex marriage case, but it does not require what the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Due process evolves. Absolutely it does. Equal protection evolves. 1964 Civil Rights Act doesn't. Now, you covered that in your column fairly, so I want to ask you something. There is now Yale Law School and a few other places are offering a one-year course in law that does not credential you to practice law. And I had to get my law for 3 years at Michigan instead of 1 year in which it can be done. And it seems to me you took it without taking it. I don't know how you know this much about the American. Most columnists who blunder into this get it wrong. Where did you get your legal education?
Let me tell you a story that will resonate with you. When I left Oxford in 1964, I applied to a great law school, and I applied to Princeton in philosophy because I couldn't decide whether to be a lawyer or an academic. I went to Princeton, I think probably because it was midway between two National League cities, and I could see the Cubs in Philadelphia and at Shea Stadium in New York. Otherwise, I could be a lawyer. You see, I wanted to teach political philosophy, but the fact is we do political philosophy in constitutional law. That's where it's done in the United States. A lot of people have said, gee, why don't we have any great texts like Locke's Second Treatise or Hobbes' Leviathan? Leaving aside the fact that the Federalist paper is as good a text of political philosophy as anything since Aristotle's Politics. Leave that aside. We do political philosophy all the time through constitutional law, arguing about the tension between freedom and equality, what justice means, etc. So when I was choosing between becoming a lawyer and becoming a professor of political philosophy, it was really a false choice. You can do both.
You can do both. And by the way, that does resonate with me deeply for a couple of reasons. The practical one, when I finished Harvard, I wanted to become a teacher of political philosophy, but I applied twice to the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and was twice rejected. So they decided for me to become a lawyer, but I get to teach political theory because I teach con law and I'm a columnist. I get to write about it. And you're right, 100% right. It is where we do political theory in the United States. And people like Jaffa and Mansfield teach it, and their students teach it. Larry Arnott Hillsdale teaches it. But very few people practice it outside of the Supreme Court and the people who comment on it. Nevertheless, having said that, I did go to law school. I had great law professors, and I clerked on the D.C. Circuit. I learned the law before I taught the law. When did you learn the law? Because you actually know it.
Well, I read the cases, and I read the briefs. I just read a brief by Ted Olson about a case coming up, and I will write a column before the oral argument on it. I just did the same a few days ago, a column based on a cert petition by Paul Clement, who knows more constitutional law than
both of us combined times 10. Yeah,
since John Marshall, yes. So it's Lincoln didn't go to law school. Neither did, for all I know, John Marshall. They didn't have law schools. So I've picked up what crumbs of knowledge I have in the old-fashioned way.
Lincoln was a hedgehog. John Marshall was a fox. And I'll tell you, Lincoln knew the Declaration and Shakespeare and the Bible. But let's proceed further instead of going into that. I want to talk a little bit about the party going forward. The serious top tier of candidates to be the next Republican nominee include Senator Cotton, Governor DeSantis, former Secretary of State Pompeo, Senator Tim Scott. There's a very, very smart, talented second tier as well, like Chris Christie and Rick Scott and Marco Rubio and Nikki Haley. But that top tier, Cotton, DeSantis, Pompeo, and Tim Scott, do you think they're serious enough to get us out of the hole in which we have fallen?
Sure they are. These are people who have, in DeSantis' case, he's run a big state. Time was we used to instinctively try to pick our presidents from governors because they'd run something larger than a Senate office. And I'd like to see us turn our attention back to governors. It's hard to do that because with modern telecommunications and all focused on Washington and in Washington focused on the presidency, it's hard to give governors their due attention. Tim Scott, wonderful story, wonderful rhetorical ability. That's part of the performative aspect of the presidency. Tom Cotton, it seems to me, combines both. He combines a serious interest in national security and terrific education, and he's actually been out there where national security is challenged. Who's the fourth person you mentioned?
Secretary of State Pompeo.
Well, there you go. He's another man who's looked into the abyss, which is the gathering threats to the United States. So there's a big, deep Republican bench.
That brings me to presidents. Now, you have known them all, Republican presidents. I worked for Reagan in the White House. I have interviewed W a few times. I knew Nixon quite well, very well. I've interviewed Trump quite a few times. Ford was the first campaign I worked on. Each of these presidents had strengths and flaws, George Will. Bush was the best man among them, I think. Nixon had the best mind. Trump got the most done for America, that's the court, and Reagan got the most done for the world by destroying Soviet communism. And Ford was the necessary man after Watergate. George W. Bush would argue, was the best man who's been. But they all had their strengths. Providence, it seems to me, gives us what we need. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's what Bismarck said. Providence looks after drunks, babies in the United States. I'd rather not have to count on Providence, but we've certainly lucked out so far. I mean, who could have done better than Lincoln in 1861? For that matter, let me say something you might disagree with. For all his flaws, personal, political, and et cetera, we were so lucky that Lyndon Johnson was president when the time came to need the 64 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 65.
No, I agree with that.
Lyndon Johnson felt the civil rights impulse the way that no president since Lincoln has.
I agree with that. Having read Caro's biography, I understand why he felt it, and he was the indispensable man. I don't know that a Northern Democrat would have had the courage. It's a Nixon to China moment before there was a Nixon to China moment. LBJ to the Southern Democrats. Let me talk about one of the things you mentioned in passing. One of the great joys of being a columnist, and I'm a contributing columnist to the Post, not like you, tenured. It's the difference between being tenured and being a visiting faculty member. And I do think I identified, you mentioned in the introduction, one of the great pleasures of being a columnist is the ability to mention a book that took years to write and to praise it. You mentioned Rick Atkinson. George W. Bush, last time I had him on the air, brought up Rick Atkinson as well. The British Are Coming. Fine book. The ability to casually toss off book titles and recommend to people that they be read. I get to do that this week. Why does that give you pleasure, George Will?
Because, as I think you and I probably agree here with the truism, that politics is downstream from culture. And books, for all the chatter about the new media, which I have no use for, I've never tweeted, except that someone in my office tweets excerpts from my column twice a week. I have a Facebook page, I'm told. I've never seen it. These things don't interest me. Books are still the primary carriers of ideas. It's not just that ideas have consequences, to take the title of one of the canonical texts of post-war conservatism, but only ideas have large and lasting consequences. And that's the delight of being a columnist, is you can write about something that's not only not above the fold of the front page of the New York Times, it's not in the New York Times. You could write about, can I give you one example?
Please.
Of all the columns in my book, the one that probably has occasioned most turmoil is my denunciation of blue jeans and denim. I just got so tired sitting, you'd be in an airport concourse, and a father, age 40, walks by with his 12-year-old son. They're dressed exactly alike. Running shoes, blue jeans, T-shirt. And if his mother's there, she's dressed the same way. There was a time, Hugh, when we demarcated the stages of life with different presentation of ourselves in dress. Now, no one grows up anymore. The infantilization of the American adult has produced a kind of parenting that produces the perpetual infantilization of American children. Helicopter parents hovering over their bubble-wrapped children, making them risk-averse. Lo and behold, they get to college, and what's the first thing they want? They want not freedom of speech, but freedom from speech that might upset their brittle little selves. They want bias response teams to fan out from safe spaces to stamp out microaggressions. And this weird cancel culture impulse doesn't stay on campus. It seeps into the larger culture. This is a long way of saying that one of the joys of being a columnist is you don't have to be tied to presidents and Supreme Court to see. You can wander around the social landscape. You know, it was once said of Napoleon, he could not look at a landscape without seeing a battlefield. And I think a columnist can't look at the world without seeing column topics. They're bombarding us.
It's interesting. Earlier in the show, having no idea that you had mentioned Napoleon, I referenced Andrew Roberts' magisterial biography of him and explaining why Mitch McConnell is the greatest Republican legislative leader of my lifetime, because he surveys the terrain and instantly knows how to win the campaign, not just a skirmish. And that's what he's done again and again and again. And that's what Napoleon did because of the quote you just mentioned. Isn't that a great book, by the way, Robert's biography of Napoleon?
Roberts is simply incapable of writing anything other than a magisterial book.
Yeah, I didn't want to like Napoleon. I wanted to hate Napoleon, but I couldn't when I was done with that book. Let me go back to American Happiness and Discontents, George Will, because I didn't read the column on blue jeans. Because when you buy a book of columns, it's like Montaigne is on my bedside. I talked about Montaigne last week with Professor Jesse McCarthy of Harvard and Andrew Sullivan, both of whom have book of columns of essays out right now, both of which are fine. And columns and essays, you get to pick and choose, and you keep the book. One of the great things in this book is I read all the legal columns. I didn't read the blue jean columns, but now you've told me I'll go read it. But it prompts this thought. The picture I'm on a quest for in the archives of the Cleveland Public Library is the one that appeared on the front page of the Cleveland Press at the last home opener that my grandfather went to, for whom I am named. He attended 40 consecutive Cleveland home openers. He was a judge and he could close his court when he wanted to do it. And he is there with Bob Feller, receiving a baseball from Bob Feller. I believe it's 1964 or 5. They both have on ties and jackets. Everybody has on a tie and a jacket. What is the percentage of American baseball fans in 2021 that attend the game in tie and jacket?
And fedora.
And fedora, you're right.
In the 1940s, they were in fedora. Did you ever see a photograph before or after his career of Joe DiMaggio when he was unshaven? Of course not.
No. No.
Again, adults back then said, "I've grown up. Now I'm going to behave like a grown-up." What a concept.
Unless they wore facial hair. Now, George, before I let you go, because your first introduction, and I'm taking you long, and thank you, American Happiness and Discontents will sell by itself because you're George Will. You say in your introduction, I came out of the Illinois wilderness. Ulysses S. Grant said, tell me about the boy and I'll tell you about the man. You allied over your Midwestern upbringing. Where did you go to high school, and what were you in high school?
I went to the University of Illinois Education Department Laboratory High School, which is to say it was full of faculty brats. And the great thing was we took 7th and 8th grade in 1 year. So I got to college I got to college just 4 months after my 17th birthday. It was so small that someone like me with zero athletic talent could play on the basketball team. I was captain of the cross-country team because no one else would do it. So it was a great place to develop one's aspirations without having to compete with 2,000 other students.
Well, I'm glad to say that we share similar abilities when it comes to sport, but my high school was sadly larger. I want to ask you about the line in there. You love working in D.C. It has some advantages, but it has some very big disadvantages. Ambition is bad when it's unchecked, and its proximity to it in D.C. is endless. Study it easily in the Beltway, perhaps, but a lot of people say Washington is Hollywood for ugly people. I actually think Washington, D.C. is actually high school sports for smarts people who were uncoordinated. Do you agree with that?
Sometimes, but our mutual friend Harvey Mansfield would want to stick a footnote in here. Ambition can be bad. It can be curdled. It can make things a mess. But the ambition for honor, for distinction, drives greatness. Churchill, Napoleon, to take two of Andrew Roberts, Lincoln, Washington. Ambition can be redeemed by that which you are ambitious for. And if it is honor and if it is worthy fame, I think Harvey Mansfield would say, let's praise it.
In a book about ambition by Joseph Epstein, I found the quote, which I've used 1,000 times. Ambition is the highest purpose of the noblest mind. And that was by Hamilton. And I believe that. But the Washington, D.C. ambition is not usually for honor and fame, is it?
No, Washington, like everything else in life, exists under the tyranny of the bell-shaped curve. At the left end, there are people who are just god awful. At the right end, there's a few that are excellent, and the mass in the middle are in the middle.
So let me ask you about something I was ignorant about, and I still am, but I want you to, I don't ever mind admitting ignorance. You write about Peter DeVries being the wittiest writer since Mark Twain. Now, if someone asked me that, I would say it was Mark Stein. I actually don't know who Peter DeVries is.
He was the literary editor of the New Yorker for many, many years, while he was the author of, at least 13 hilariously good novels. There's no better analyst of the America, say from the 1950s to the 1990s, than Peter DeVries. Everyone, after you purchase my book, go out, get on the line and get some of Peter DeVries's.
All right. If you want to send me a recommendation where to begin, last week I admitted to Jesse McCarthy. I'd be interested. I've not read the novels of Toni Morrison. Have you?
Nope.
And he was stunned. And I said, sorry, it just wasn't on my path. I'll go back. He says, you can't understand American literature or the African-American experience without reading Toni Morrison. She's the greatest fiction writer of the 20th century, and she won the Nobel. And I said, well, the Nobel means nothing to me. I'll take your word for it. And so I'm reading and finding it very, very interesting, beloved. So I'll take your word on Peter DeVries. I want to know who you admire as a columnist. Did you admire Michael Kelly, who I did a lot?
Oh, absolutely. Michael was wonderful. He tragically killed in Iraq, I guess.
Yes.
But no, he was terrific. I go back. My lodestar remains Murray Kempton. But there's a tremendous number of very talented young writers these days. When I see the byline of Andrew Ferguson, I read it.
Andy is my age, and yes. But what about Ross Douthat, for example? I mean, there are people, the torch has to pass from people who are over 60 to people who are under 60 in the opining world. Eventually, it does. Who will those people be who you hope it lands with?
Well, when they pry the torch out of my cold dead hands, I don't know. I hope it's plucked up by Jonathan Rauch, by Charles Lane of the Washington Post, our colleague there. Ross is a Catholic, serious man, but more interested in religious questions than I am. But there's just no shortage of very fine writers. A lot of them with National Review, Jonah Goldberg and David French with the Bulwark and others. Tremendous amount of good writing going on.
Oh, we've ended, though, back in the Never Trump cul-de-sac where I can't get anyone ever to admit that without Trump, we would have lost the Constitution. It is my endless argument with David French is a great lawyer, a great intellect, a fine writer, and others are in this camp as well. But eventually you have to come to that intersection of the court and Trump and say, oh, well, yeah, he was difficult, but he saved us. Let me close, George Will, because you just mentioned in passing religion. You and Justice did not hold the free exercise clause in sufficient esteem as to protect it when Smith came along, or to honor, and I want Smith to be reversed, and Amy Coney Barrett said it's going to happen, but we need to think this through because this is important. I just wonder if you agree with me that without religion, and Washington's position, this is not new to me, this is Washington's position, without religion, whether or not you personally embrace it, the West cannot be the West because it provides the common education bedrock of virtue.
Certainly the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, by identifying the individual, by pulling the individual out of tribes and guilds and races, by elevating the individual, was this religious tradition was a precondition for the liberal democratic society of rights-bearing people. So George Washington was made an instrumental point. He said religion is instrumentally important to free societies, which presuppose virtue, and virtue presupposes religion. In the past, I think that has been so. Whether it will be so going forward, I do not know. The growth of this nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. People who say, when asked what their religious affiliation is, they say none. That is the most rapidly growing component of our society. So, one way or another, we're going to find out.
Or we are going to have a rekindling of religious belief. I hope it's the latter, because I do believe American happiness depends upon the free exercise clause and the people who shelter under it. And the discontents come from those who are not under its protection actively. And so that was a nice way to finish the interview, George Will, by telling people American Happiness and Discontents is a wonderful book. The subtitle, The Unruly Torrent, is a wonderful subtitle. And I thank you for it, and thanks for your generous dollop of time this morning.
Well, I've enjoyed it. We didn't even get to baseball.
Well, that's because I don't want to. I'm afraid to ask you. I will ask you. What do you think of the Indians changing their name? I've written a column that it doesn't matter to me. It can't break my will to love the team and the sport. What do you think?
Well, I sort of regret that they're changing it. I think if they hadn't had that Chief Wahoo caricature, there would have been less pressure for this. And I think the Guardians is simply god awful. I mean,
I agree.
Come on.
Should have been the Blue Sox referencing the lake. I agree.
Or the Commodore Perrys. Who cares? I mean, anything but the Guardians. Referring to a bridge, please.
Yeah, the unforced error there is terrible. Yeah, it does remind me though. I left the question out. Do you listen to podcasts?
Not really. No.
The reason I wanted to ask you about that, because sports podcasts, which are very, very vast, and I listen to 4 of them a week about the Browns and the Ohio State, they are actually the rain delay of baseball games. Now, probably the best interview I've ever done, not because I had anything to do with it, because of who I was interviewing, is with Vin Scully. An hour of radio perfection, because he is the perfect broadcaster. And he told wonderful stories. It was perfect. And he learned that. I figured this out because he did rain delays. And he can tell a story. Podcasting is rain delays. That's all it is. It's Herb Score, it's Vin Scully, it's whoever you listen to. They knew how to do that.
The only voicemail I have saved on my phone is when Vinny called me about a column I'd written about him to thank me for it. And I remember Vin Scully they were getting ready for a broadcast. He was going over the lineups, and he said, the Chicago Cubs say Andre Dawson is day-to-day, but aren't we all?
I'm going to leave it there because actually you can't improve on Vin Scully. George Will, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Enjoyed it.